Welcome to another session of Sharpe Takes, and I am delighted today to have a preeminent citizen of the state of Vermont, Bill Schubart, as my guest. Now, Bill has a long and wonderful history of work in Vermont. I first met him in a recording studio in Ferrisburg, where he was recording the songs of Utah Phillips. Mm-hmm. And he's gone on to do many things after that recording studio. He started as an educator, as a matter of fact, teaching French in our local high school, Mount Abraham High School. If you want to know more about Bill's bio, you need to look at his website, which is displayed on your screen. It's a long and varied bio, and he's most noted recently for his work as an author and commentator. In that regard, Bill, welcome, first of all.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Great. And just wonder what your take is on public education, where we stand today.
Well, I think one of the things that troubles me is, when I was young, when I first became politically conscious, it was the Dean Davis era. And, we were all sitting around, with fairly comprehensible challenges like, should we sell whiskey on Sunday? Should we have daylight savings time? I mean, there were things that you could get your head around. Now what we're dealing with, almost any one of the things you pick, healthcare, housing, financing public education, the environment, any one of those is almost like a college degree. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, they're big
So
problems.
There's so much misinformation and misunderstanding. And to me, that's one of the great, that's how you measure a leader. Did they take complex systems and talk about them in a way that's comprehensible and lead people towards solutions together rather than polarizing? But I think financing public education is, one of the two or three most important things we face in Vermont. Housing is one, healthcare is another. And, how do we get there?
If I could take you back in time, you served on a three-member Blue Ribbon Tax Commission numerous years ago.
Yep.
And I think some of that information's still valid. What was your view then, and how has it evolved to now in terms of how we should tax citizens?
Well, it's very interesting that you asked that question, because we were asked to do two steps. And the first step was to look at the current tax system and essentially redesign it, which we did. Phase two was to talk about what the ideal tax system would be for Vermont, and they canceled that part of it, the legislature. That we never got to phase two. And but there was a lot of stuff in phase one that would have been part of phase two. There were things like, we thought it was important to not just tax sales, but to tax services. And the example that we gave is, somebody who's not wealthy goes out and buys a lawnmower and pays a tax on it. Somebody who's wealthy hires someone to come mow their lawn, and they don't pay tax on it. Oh. So that was one of our recommendations that didn't get followed up. And there were a number. It's actually still posted on the Legislative Blue Ribbon Tax Commission. In the legislative, all our recommendations are there in a very concise, you can actually read them all on one page. But again, just as we were to get started on phase two, the education part, canceled.
Yeah. So it's been interesting recently. People have been asking, press has been asking, okay, what's your plan? And the governor and the Speaker of the House have been reluctant to put forth a plan that we can have a discussion about, right? Scott Beck, Republican new Senate minority leader in the Vermont Senate, has put forward a plan.
Yep.
And the NEA and the Public Asset Institute have collaborated on putting forward a plan. So the two plans differ significantly, and I would say sort of in broad strokes, the NEA Public Assets Plan moves more completely to income-based.
Yes.
And the Scott Beck default Republican plan, if I may phrase
Sure.
it that way, returns us to the foundation formula.
Yeah. I mean, the difficulty is, and this takes us into a very difficult area, is, you know, the whole issue, as you just asked me before, is about taxation. You know, if we tax income, and it's complicated in Vermont because we have a very high Gini quotient. It's not the highest in the country. It was at one point, but it's high. Gini quotient is the ratio of, you know, poverty to great wealth.
Okay.
And we have very, very significant wealth in Vermont. It's discrete. They don't live in mansions and so on and so forth, but it's there. Mm-hmm. And I can say that because I've done a lot of development work for nonprofits. And when we had the tax commission operative, we had very wealthy people come in and say to us, "You don't tax us enough.
Yeah.
You should tax us more."
They even had a press conference at one point in the State House and said that out loud.
Yep. And I think that's a real issue. And again, you know, the governor has focused on his affordability thing, which he doesn't define. He doesn't take it down and say what is driving the affordability crisis in housing or in healthcare, you know, and he doesn't relate it to taxation. He just says, "I'm against taxation and regulation." That's very formulaic, but it doesn't solve our problems. And again, you know this as well as anyone, answers are not black and white. They're not one or the other. They lie somewhere in the messy middle.
Yeah.
And that's what a great leader does, is they help us have that discussion and take us to that middle.
The whole issue or commentary around the notion of affordability escapes me. I mean, if you have money in your pocket, lots of things are affordable. If you don't, nothing's affordable,
Yeah.
right? And that's the simplistic response. But affordability means very different things to different people.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, you know, many, many years ago when I was chair of the Business Roundtable, I suggested that we meet with the Peace and Justice Center, which did not go over very well with a lot of the CEOs, but we did. And it was to talk about the concept of a livable wage. And again, we made the decision to wade in with different opinions to a very difficult topic, and it was amazing how much we agreed upon. You know, what does a livable wage buy? You know, is it a car? What kind of car? Is it 2 TVs or 1 TV?
Yeah.
And we actually ended up arriving at a number that we could agree on.
Well.
Yeah, and that was back when Ellen Kaler was, you know,
Yeah.
and she's gone on to do wonderful things. But
So what was that number, if I can
back
ask?
then it was 22,000. Right now it would be at least twice that.
Yeah. Annual income.
Pardon?
Annual income, 22,000.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Individual, not household.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
But again, I mean, I know people whose gross family income is in the $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 range, and they can't make ends meet.
No.
You know, and these are not people who feel they have to have a $70,000 car. These are people who go out and buy a used car every 3 years.
Well, there are families that I know of where both parents are working.
Yeah,
Since they're both working in different locations, they need to have 2 cars.
yeah,
They have 2 kids.
yeah,
They have a house with a mortgage.
right,
And it's not like money's flowing out of their pockets. You know,
Right.
they're struggling to make ends meet.
and then they've got daycare.
Yeah, well, the kids are in public school.
Yeah,
And some have been arguing, oh, yeah, well, those kids should have choice. You know, that we should make it so that they get a subsidy from the state tax dollars to send their kids anywhere they want to go.
I mean, that makes no sense to me. And I'm talking as a person who went to kindergarten, nursery school, and grade school in Morrisville, Vermont, and then went to Phillips Exeter, which is like the opposite extreme. I didn't even know what Exeter was.
Yeah.
And the only reason I got in is because my father had gone there, so it's just, that the idea that somebody could send their kid to Phillips Exeter and get support for that, and the tuition I think now is somewhere around 70 or 80,000 bucks a year, and it obviously wouldn't be that much, but any support at all makes no sense to me. And it also, based on the little I know, our Constitution is based on paid public education, not paid private education. And we also have, the division between religious schools and public schools. And seeing that erode in Vermont, to me, is really troublesome.
Yeah, I am disappointed at the leadership in the state with regard to the federal Supreme Court ruling that money needs to flow to, if you're going to give vouchers, then those vouchers need to also be available for religious schools.
Yeah.
And that flies directly in the face of Vermont Constitution.
I agree.
And I think the voucher system that we have in place where kids are getting a subsidy to go to Phillips Exeter, I think that flies in the face of Brigham and the equity provisions. Kids in my district can't get that tax subsidy because all our kids go to public schools.
Yeah. Well, Alan Gilbert, used to be head of the ACLU. Yeah. He's still a good friend, and I was on their board years ago. And, his book on the Brigham decision and the fact that Vermont is the only state in the Union that retained the Common Benefits Clause. Every state that went to Philadelphia to copy the Pennsylvania, state constitution came back. They all had this Common Benefits Clause, and they all, over time, the elite interests got it removed. Yeah. Vermont still has it.
Yeah.
And I think that's remarkably powerful.
It should be. And we should have leadership that enforces that or looks at the way we spend money through that lens. Yeah. Are we giving common benefits to our Vermont citizens? And I think we fail that test in several ways.
I completely agree with you. We're failing it now in healthcare for sure. There are two things that I would add. I got in somewhat hot water because I was really questioning the child care investment. And the reason is I was watching, Lincoln, Ripton, all these communities struggling, wanting to keep their primary schools open, but not having enough economic, support for it. Shrinking number of kids. Right. And then, going out and spending $170 million to finance daycare centers. And I know I'm oversimplifying it. What I wanted to see us do was to redefine public education in Vermont and say basically public education begins at birth and ends at death. And there's a 6-month paid family bonding period. We keep our precious primary schools open, and they are open to people from the age of 6 months going forward. So the whole concept of childcare to me felt like storage, and what I wanted to say, and the most critical learning part for so many kids is before they get into school.
Well, yes, and my belief is that kids are sponges from the day they're born. They just absorb, so they are learning every day.
That's right.
The question is, what are they learning? How are they learning? Not daycare in the sense of a storage facility where you're not learning for a while before you go to school.
Just imagine if we forgot about the concept of childcare and we redefined public education as our local schools being open at 6 months. Then it becomes mandatory at age, 4 or 5, whatever it is, to go into the school. And, so you're actually educating. And then, interestingly enough, we're moving towards lifelong learning.
Yeah.
Because people not everybody has the opportunity to go to UVM or Harvard, Yale, Princeton. And I think that level of higher education is becoming much less significant than community colleges. And, I've really looked carefully at CCV, Community College of Vermont, which I think is one of the greatest models in the country. I mean, they're educating people inside the criminal justice system.
Yeah. Yeah.
Giving them a second chance.
Yeah.
So, if you look at that model and you realize that CCV is one of the more expensive community colleges in the country, not because they spend a lot of money, it's because they get no support. And I asked point blank, I said, how much money would you need to have no tuition? And they said $35 million. That's nothing. That is nothing. $35 million, and all of a sudden CCV has no tuition, like many other states.
Yeah.
I mean, I just think we need to completely rethink public education, how we fund it, what it is. Sorry, didn't mean to go off on a rant.
No, I think that's perfectly laudable, actually. And then if we look at public education funds that are currently in this big education fund,
Yeah.
It's not an insignificant amount of money that's spent out of that fund on things other than public education.
Yeah. Well, when you realize that depending on the data you look at, there's somewhere around $350 million a year in waste just at the UVM Medical Center. I mean, that's documented with national numbers.
Yeah.
What would that do in public education? What would that do in primary care? We need to take care of people in our communities so they don't, I hate to say this, but I often say that the repositories of our upstream socioeconomic failures have become our classrooms, our emergency rooms, and our jail cells.
Yeah.
That's where all our mistakes end up. And it's infinitely more expensive to try and fix something that's broken than it is to go back up into the communities, fund them appropriately, to educate and prevent.
I had the good fortune last night to see Bess O'Brien's film on Getting By, which has to do with poverty and living in poverty in Vermont.
Yep.
And the interviews of the people. So kids, through no fault of their own, are moved from place to place to place. They don't know what to call home. They're embarrassed to tell their classmates where they live.
Yep.
And we are failing in taking care of those children.
Absolutely.
I have to say, though, on the other hand, I think, we talk about results in school. And in a lot of ways, Vermont does an outstanding job in our schools.
I agree.
Some of the test scores are low. And one of the reasons I think that we have a disparity that we're not pleased with in our test scores and other ways of measuring education is that we make a supreme effort once these kids get to public schools, that in our school buildings, we make a supreme effort to bring equitable education to all those kids.
Yeah.
And so, we do this on the shoulders of teachers and principals and superintendents across the state, school boards, who are trying their best in a flawed system to raise every child to their highest level.
I get very, very defensive when people go on and on about teachers this, teachers that. I mean, I've been a teacher. I knew teachers. I've known teachers all over Vermont, and I feel the same way that I do about legislators. When people complain about legislators, these are committed, hardworking people. They're not all perfect, but from the ones that I've met and the experiences I've had, these are people who really, really focus on the well-being of children. I think another issue, though, David, that's really critical is social media. And Angela Arsenault, you probably know the legislator, Angela Arsenault, She's also chair of the school board at CVU, and I've talked with her quite a bit about this. They are actually on the verge of taking a serious step about saying no smartphones in the schools. We had 2 foreign exchange students with us, one from Moldova and one from Serbia, dirt poor families, went to CVU each for the whole year. They lived with us for a year. And they didn't know each other. And when they left, they both said, "You should be ashamed of what you allow in your schools." And they both said social media.
Huh.
And they talked about kids sitting there with, phones on, watching movies during class.
Yeah.
And I think that didn't exist when I was a kid. I mean, the distraction for us was looking out in the parking lot and see who had the nicest car, Anyway.
I think we have a long way to go to figure out in this nation, not just with regard to school kids, but people's use of social media. So if you publish something, if you write a letter to the editor, or you publish something in the newspaper, or a newspaper decides to do a news story, there are certain parameters, regulations around which they can print liable information, right? And yet none of that, to my knowledge, none of those restrictions apply to social media. So you can, in many cases, anonymously say virtually anything that you want to say on social media and get away with it. I mean,
when I have a column in Vermont Digger every other week, I get, I get anywhere, and then it goes out to another 4,000 people who have opted in to just get a copy of it. I inevitably get 50 to 100 emails, and some of them are, "You communist bastard, why don't you move back to China where you belong?" And I realize, and instead of the people who write and say, "Thank you for saying that, that was really important," I say thank you to them. But then the other person I say, "Thank you for writing, thank you for being interested. I'm only sorry that you weren't more clear about your own feelings, because I might have learned something from you." And of course it's like silence. Dead, because all they want to do is sit in their basement and hurl the grenade. They don't want to have a conversation.
Right. So that's what we're trying to do with this program, is have a little bit of a conversation. So we bring thoughts, energy, leadership, hopefully, to the discussion, informed discussion about education in Vermont. So if we were to look at redesigning education in Vermont to be just exactly the way we wanted it, you talk about going from essentially public education in schools from ages 4 or 5 to adulthood, right? One of the ways that we don't accomplish that now, in my view, is that the access to technical centers for students is difficult. So kids in Mount Abe, which you're familiar with Mount Abe, those children can access the tech center here in Middlebury. They have to have either take a bus ride for half their day, sort of abandon their academic career in order to pursue a technical career. It seems to me that every high school, and maybe there should be fewer of them, but every high school should have a technical aspect to them.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, when I grew up in Morrisville, the guys that I knew, almost all of them were farm kids. And, they were my friends, and they never heard of Harvard, Yale, or Princeton. They didn't care about that. Their idea of Harvard was the St. Johnsbury Vocational School. I could go there, I could learn diesel mechanics, and I could come home and help Dad keep his tractors running.
Absolutely.
And I could get a good job, And the women who were interested, they didn't have it anywhere near as many options, unfortunately. But there was Johnson Teachers College. They could be a teacher. And, that dichotomy between, learning technical and, getting an associate degree, that's highly functional and learning, arts and humanities. That doesn't have to be a division.
Right. It should be both, actually.
It should be both.
Yeah.
And at a point where if you decide, well, gosh, I'm really, really interested in community theater, but I need a job, I want to learn airline mechanics. You can do both.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, my training in college was as a chemist.
Yeah.
And my first job really was building houses, and my second job was fixing cars. So
you kept my Saabs running.
And I was able to do those jobs well because I was taught how to think and how to view the world and how to analyze text in my academic courses.
Yes.
So they're married, whether you want to
Absolutely.
separate them or not. They turns out they're connected.
Absolutely, yeah. I don't know. The whole area is fascinating to me. I think that the most difficult thing that we face right now is the level of misunderstanding. My schools are driving my taxes crazy. And the question I ask my neighbors is, do you really believe we pay our teachers too much money? Do you really believe that? And do you understand that the cost of health care in education is now $300 million a year?
It's a chunk of change out of the education fund.
It's a huge chunk. And it's not our teachers that are at fault. It's the infrastructure, the cost of infrastructure. Anyway, you understand.
Should we be reducing the number of high schools in Vermont? Should we have one per county, maybe?
My theory is real simple. It's all age-driven. I want my infant children in my family. I want my young children in my community in a primary school, kindergarten, nursery school, up through 3rd or 4th grade. I'm happy to have them have a bus trip, 5 or 10 miles to a junior high, and maybe further for senior high. And then for college, get them the hell out of the country. Send them to France. Do you know what I mean?
Well, at least away from home, I think.
Exactly. I mean, it's a trajectory away from the home, but it's age-driven.
Yeah. Well, it's been delightful to have you here today.
Well, it's been wonderful to reconnect.
Yeah, and bring a perspective to education, because this state is struggling with what we should do regarding public education. And I very much appreciate your commentary. Keep it up.
Well,
I'm looking forward to reading some of your books. So thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you, Dave. It's really nice to reconnect. And thank you for all your work in the legislature.
And that closes out another session here of Sharpe Takes, another look at public education. Thanks for joining us.